Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Glad to be here and glad to see you all here. Glad to be here on a beautiful day. I don't know if it's going to stay. I think they said what's his name? I was going to say hedgehog. He's not a hedgehog. Who? Groundhog. They say the groundhog saw his own shadow, so I don't know. I guess it's going to get colder. We'll see, but it feels great today. This morning we're going to continue our message in Nehemiah 11. As we open, I'm just curious, has anyone ever won the lottery? Anybody ever won the lottery? No? Oh, Will's asking if we have a new church. We'd have a new church building if we won the lottery. Well, this chapter has a little bit to do with somewhat winning the lottery, but it was a different kind of lottery. It was a lottery where the winners had to move into a half-ruined city surrounded by enemies and in the midst of political turmoil. Does anybody want to play that lottery? This was a lottery no one wanted to win. Coming up to this chapter, the walls of Jerusalem have been rebuilt, and the city, however, is still empty. If we can kind of imagine what's happened, and if you're like me, as I read through this kind of quickly when I first started to go into this book, it seemed like, well, these people are living in the city, and the city's full, and they're just rebuilding the walls. But when we understand cities in the ancient world, there was no one living there, because for it to be a city, it had to have walls. It had to be something that was protected. And then we look at this chapter, and we almost see a hint of people here who preferred the countryside. Anybody prefer the countryside? Anybody prefer living out in the sticks? Anybody? We do. We kind of live out of town a little bit. And that's because they had better land, especially at a time where you had to either grow your own food or buy it from someone else. It wasn't the same system that we have today. They had better homes. Even if we look at some of the stories that we have before this in our Bibles, you see stories where they just kind of live like almost in apartments in the cities. You could have bigger homes. You could have nicer spreads. You could have whatever you desired. And their homes were generally made out of mud, so it's not like you had to have, $800,000 to build a nice house. You could just build a house for whatever your labor cost you and however it would fit on your plot of land. They had nicer homes, and then most importantly, I think they had no political trouble out there. They had no political trouble or any kind of, they weren't facing any kind of war or any kind of violence that they faced in this process of rebuilding the city. But this chapter, as we look at this lottery, this chapter was about faithfulness, about the calling of certain people, and about God's unexpected plans for some of their lives. And here they cast lots in this chapter, and they pick those who were going to move back to the city, and then some people bravely volunteered to do so. They stepped up to the plate. So we'll start by reading the text here. We'll start in Nehemiah chapter 11, verse 1. And this is another chapter where as I read into it and as I was studying and praying and looking at this chapter, it's a chapter that previously maybe you're like me and you would have just read through it quickly because it just lists a bunch of names. But I think it's important that we understand the message behind the names. So read with me now. It says, "Now the leaders of the people stayed in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots for 1 out of 10 to come and live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the other 9 tenths remain in their towns. The people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the heads of the province who stayed in Jerusalem. But in the villages of Judah, each lived on his own property in their own towns, the Israelites, the priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants, while some of the descendants of Judah and Benjamin settled in Jerusalem. Judah's descendants: Ataliah, son of Uzziah, son of Zechariah, son of Amariah, son of Shephatiah, son of Mahalalel, of Perez's descendants, and Maaseiah, son of Baruch, son of Kol-Hazeh, son of Hazalah, son of Adiah, son of Yoariv, son of Zechariah, descendant of Shilonite. The total number of Perez's descendants who settled in Jerusalem were 468 capable men. These were Benjamin's descendants: Salu, son of Meshullam, son of Yoed, son of Pedaiah, son of Koliah, son of Maaseiah, son of Itael, son of Yeshaiah, and after him Gabai, son of Soliah, 928. Yoel, son of Zikri, was officer over them, and Judah, son of Hassanua, was second in command over the city. The priest Yediah, son of Yoariv, Yohin, and Sariah, son of Zilkiah, son of Meshullam, son of Yodak, son of Meriat, son of Ahitub, the chief official of God's temple, and their relatives who did the work at the temple. Adiah, son of Yeracham, son of Pelaliah, son of Amzi, son of Zechariah, son of Pashur, son of Malchiah, and his relatives, the heads of families. Amashsai, son of Atzarel, son of Azai, son of Meshilemot, son of Emer, and their relatives, capable men, 128. Zavdiel, son of Hagadelim, was their chief. The Levites: Shemaiah, son of Hashuv, son of Azrikam, son of Hashabiah, son of Buni, and Shabbatai, and Yazabad, from the heads of the Levites who supervised the work outside the house of God. Mattaniah, son of Micah, son of Zavdi, son of Asaph, the one who began the thanksgiving and prayer. Bakbukiah, second among the relatives, and Avdah, son of Shamuah, son of Galai, son of Yedutun. All the Levites of the holy city, 284. The gatekeepers, Akuv, Talmon, and their relatives who guarded the city gates, 172. The rest of Israel, the priests and the Levites, were all in their villages of Judah, each on his own inherited property. The temple servants lived on Ophel, Zihah, and Gishpah, supervised the temple servants. The leader of the Levites in Jerusalem was Uzzi, son of Bani, son of Hashabiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Micah, and the descendants of Asaph, who were the singers for the service of God's house. There was in fact a command of the king regarding them and an ordinance regulating the singers' daily task. Petahiah, son of Meshezavel, of the descendants of Zerah, son of Judah, who was the king's agent in every matter concerning the people. As for the farming settlements with their fields, some of Judah's descendants lived in Kiriath Arba and Dibon and their surrounding villages, Yakavzael and the settlements in Yeshua, Maladah, Beit Pelet, Chatzor, Shual, and Beersheba, and its surrounding villages, in Ziklag and Mechana, and the surrounding villages, in Rimmon, Zorah, and Yarmut, and Zanoah, and Adullam, with their settlements, in Lachish, with its fields, and Azekah, and its surrounding villages. So they settled from Beersheba to Hinnom Valley. Benjamin's descendants from Geva, Michmash, Ayah, and Beit El, and its surrounding villages. Anatot, Nob, Ananiah, Chatzor, Ramah, Git Yam, Hadid, Zeboim, Nevalot, Lod, and Ono in Craftsman's Valley. Some of the Judean divisions of Levites were in Benjamin. Amen. Amen. Anybody else want to read that next time? What's that? Oh, Caleb. Caleb will take it next time. All right. When we think about this, this chapter, when I look at this chapter, I see this thread that we've seen all the way through it, and we didn't start in Ezra, but we've talked about it continuously. As we've gone through this concept in Ezra and Nehemiah, we see some themes, and one of them is this thread of holiness that I think really continues in this chapter. Because after taking a solemn oath to reconsecrate themselves to the instructions of God, to the Torah, and its laws, the holy people have now turned their attention to populating and securing the holy city. So now they've recognized that they're a holy and they're a set-apart people, and they've been brought to this place for a set-apart purpose. They realize that God's instructions are holy and they're set apart. They're different from the rest of the world. When they are done, they are what set them apart from the rest of the world, and now they see the city as part of that extension of holiness. And here, they cast lots, and it's interesting that they cast lots that 1 out of 10 were chosen by lots. Now, when I think about this, imagine the tension that was happening, because essentially they're saying, whoever gets this lot, whoever this lot is cast for, you're going to pick up, you and your family. You're going to go away from the comfort zone of where you live now, and you're going to resettle in the city of Jerusalem. I think it's interesting that there's a mention of a tenth, that it's 1 out of 10 that this comes after the previous chapter, in chapter 10, where we looked at tithes and the gifts that were detailed there at the end. Because here, as it seems that they were willing in the previous chapter to give tithes, and they were willing to give these gifts, now they're giving a tithe of the people to God's purpose. You may ever thought of themselves as a tithe. You may ever thought of themselves as something that's given over to God in that way. I think in a way the settlers here, they formed a tithe of the entire population of Israel to be dedicated to God in the place where his temple will rest, in the place where it has rested before. And I think it's pretty clear that this wasn't an attractive ask. This wasn't something that they just willingly wanted to do. Nobody was raising their hands and running to make sure that they were the ones who were chosen, because if that was the case, they wouldn't have had to cast lots. They would have just been lining up saying, I'll go. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's okay. Imagine all the stuff they've been through as they've helped rebuild the city walls. You could imagine saying, you want me to go back to the place where we were all attacked incessantly by people that don't want us to exist. You want us to do that? It makes sense. They also probably preferred the property where they lived. Imagine like if you lived on family land that you have cultivated, that you've had farms for generations, that your parents grew up planting the same crops. And these are exiles, but also remember that not everyone went into exile. So some of these families have never had to leave their farms or their places where they've lived ever, for generations, going back to the original crossing over the Jordan, to the original assigning of the plots of land. Imagine the social connections. Imagine having to pick up and leave everyone that you're used to being around all the time. For some of us, it's familiar. We've moved around, we've done things, we've come and gone across the world. For some of us, we've never left our own neighborhoods that we live in right now. Imagine being told you had to leave. I think the cost of living may have been something that would have caused concern as well. Even today, imagine living in a city. If you go to any city in America, some cost more than the others, but even just moving to Dallas, the cost of living is extremely greater than it costs to live here. People always say, I love when we talk about teacher salaries, and we should pay our teachers more in Louisiana, but everyone says, well, I can go to Dallas and make 2 or 3 times more, ignoring the fact that it costs 2 or 3 times more to live there. How much are you actually making more? I'm not sure. I haven't done the math. But I think that we don't think about that. They may have been thinking about that. How much would it cost for a family to live on a plot of land where their entire sustenance and their entire stability of their family is based around the very crops that they plant for themselves, they harvest themselves, and they consume themselves? And now they're being asked to go to a city. Now they will have to purchase these crops from someone else. They'll have to figure out a whole other type of means of being able to get money or be able to purchase these things or barter. It's a whole shift of a lifestyle. And typical of Ezra and Nehemiah, faith is first exhibited by the leaders who choose to go regardless. The leaders, it says at the beginning of the chapter, if we look back at verse 1, now the leaders of the people stayed in Jerusalem. They didn't have to cast lots. They didn't have to try to figure out who was going to go and leave their comfort zone. They said, we'll all leave our comfort zone, because they understood the cost. They understood the importance of their role, and they understood the importance of their position. And here we have this idea of casting lots, and for those who aren't familiar, it's, small pieces of wood or stone. Today we'd call them dice. People get uncomfortable calling it that with the biblical context, but that's essentially what they were. They were little small figures that if you rolled them or threw them, that they would present a certain aspect of choice. And this determined who would move here. They would also make other decisions, and that it seems like this would be somewhat of luck. That's kind of how we think about these things today. Casting lots was done differently back then as well. Sometimes they would do what we would call drawing straws. They would literally draw straws, or they had a unique thing, at least in the time of Jesus, where they would put their hands behind their back, and they would either put a 1 or a 2 on each hand. They could do 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, however, whatever combination. Everybody would do that behind their backs, and then someone would have a number, like we'd say pick a number. Say you pick the number 7. Then everybody would bring their fingers back around, and the person who's casting the lot would count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's how it landed on you. And we would think that this would just be a matter of luck. But that's not how they viewed it in the ancient world. They viewed this as a process in which they were giving control of the decision to the divine. In Israel, that would be they're giving Yahweh the decision-making ability in the process. And I would say this wasn't just a thought. The Bible tells us this is actually what happened. In Proverbs 16:33, for example, it says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So they understood, and God says through His Word that this is how He operated at times. When it came time for a decision, it wasn't a decision that the people would make, but a people that the Lord would make through the casting of lots. I think today we'd be pretty uncomfortable with this concept. We're going to make this great decision. God, I think I'm trying to decide whether to sell my house or to keep it. What do you think? Let's roll some dice. That almost sounds sacrilegious. That almost sounds like we get in trouble. That says that God says that's how He operated back then, at least. And the rest of the people who, after these lots were cast, they saw the people who were going to leave, and it says they blessed them. Now, me in my head, I'm like, oh, sure, they blessed them. Oh, y'all are so blessed. Good luck. But I think they truly blessed them because they recognized the sacrifice, but also they're glad it wasn't them. Verse 2 here, there's a strong sense of community and solidarity in this passage. When we look at verse 2, Nehemiah did not coerce anyone to move to the city. And forced settlement was not an uncommon thing in the ancient world. Forcing people to move from one place to another, saying that they don't have a choice, we're going to take them from this plot of land and put them over here, and it doesn't matter what you say about it, or if you think you have a choice, you don't, was not an uncommon thing. And specifically, moving people from a rural place to make sure that we fill a city was definitely something that was done. Scholar Yamuchi explains that the practice of redistributing populations was also used to establish Greek and Hellenistic cities. This would be at the same time as this is happening and even later. They had a phrase that they used for it, and this was a forcible transfer from rural settlements to urban centers. And why would that be the case? Because, what's that? It's wrong because it's forced. Yeah, it's wrong because it's forced. And why was this the case? Why did they move to urban cities? Because the cities were where the rulers lived. The cities were where governance was. The cities were where they thought that they needed support, and it was this redistribution. But here, in this case, they volunteered to live in Jerusalem. At least that's the sense that I get from this, is that to participate in the rolling of the dice or participate in the casting of lots, you have to be a willing participant. There's nothing that's stated here where there's some edict that goes out and says you have to do this. These people were volunteering for the work that God had for their nation, for their country, for their people, And they recognized what had to be done. They recognized that someone in some process had to willingly settle or resettle the city of Jerusalem. I think that we also need to recognize that those who did not relocate to Jerusalem bless those who did because of this process. I joke around, sure, we don't have to go, that's good. But they recognize this greater good, this calling of doing something for the betterment of the entire nation, this calling of doing something that speaks or means something more than outside of your individual life. I think that's harder and harder to find today. In a society where we individualize everything, it's about you and what you can have and what you need and you know, you do you and your truth and all this stuff, that's antithetical to the message of God's Word. It's not an individualized faith, but a communal faith. It's one that sees the community as something better than our life. Back in 2014, if y'all might remember the Ebola crisis that happened, there was a person named Dr. Kent Brantley. And he was an American doctor, and he was serving in a medical missionary in Liberia when this outbreak happened in 2014. And he could have left because they were evacuating a lot of people. And if you ever pay attention to outbreaks in other nations, you'll see where, especially when it's a missionary type nation, where a undeveloped country where you have a lot of work, volunteer type work going on, they'll try to say, hey, you can evacuate now, we can get you out. And he could have left, but he chose not to. He chose to stay. He understood his calling that God had on him. That God had called him to the people of Liberia to serve them in a way that most wouldn't. And ultimately, he did contract Ebola. He contracted himself, but he did survive. He received an experimental treatment, but Dr. Brantley saw something beyond himself. He saw God's calling that meant something more than his own life. And I think this calling that he saw was similar to what we see here in this move to Jerusalem that people did at the time of Nehemiah. I think I've read through this chapter before, and I've just kind of minimalized it in the past as I've read through it, because it's really kind of quick. It's like this 2-3 verses in this chapter that talk about this casting of lots, but it is a huge undertaking that happens here. There is complete selflessness that happens. Dr. Brantley was placed in a situation that seemed, for most people, more like a burden than a blessing. And I think these people in Israel at this time would have felt the same way. But his willingness to go to difficult places and to stay in that difficult place, to stay in that uncomfortable situation that he was in, resulted in lives being saved, no doubt. The people of Israel, no doubt, lives were saved because they chose to willingly go and resettle the land. I think this is important for us, just in these first couple of verses of this chapter, that we realize that sometimes God calls us to uncomfortable places, sometimes even dangerous places, sometimes dangerous situations. I still, share what our church does. We have a small church, but I think we make a big impact on the community we have. We have the Parkview Ministry. We started something similar back when we were downtown. I forgot what we called it, the Yeshua Walk or something like that. And I remember one of the first times we crossed the bridge and went into West Monroe, and we were going to go in that neighborhood south towards the interstate from the Endom Bridge, that there was a guy standing in a parking lot, and he was like, "Where y'all going?" And we're like, "We're going to go in here and talk to people about Jesus." And he was like, "Y'all are crazy. Don't do that." He lived in the neighborhood, He's like, "Y'all can't go in there." "No, that's fine. We'll go in here. It's all good." Sometimes God calls us to places that seem dangerous to the rest of the world. It's not so dangerous when God goes before us. And that's because these dangerous situations, or these situations that seem uncomfortable, are not for our benefit, but for the benefit of God and His glory, and for the benefit of others' well-being when He calls us to it. When we look at going kind of to the rest of the big chunk of the chapter here, I just want to make some points about some of these names that are stated. And he goes through and kind of starts naming all of these people, and it's almost like I kind of imagine, these names are on a list, and Nehemiah is standing at the city gate and like checking everybody into the city. It's like Bob, son of Larry, son of Bill from apartment 3C. Y'all are going to go over here to this city gate and go to your new place. But these weren't like kings or warriors that are being named here. These people are given honor. They're in our scriptures. They have been named in our scriptures, and today in 2025, we're reading these names from people who resettled this land 1,500 years ago. 1,500 years ago, their namesake has been established. Normal people like everybody in this room. Just everyday folks. These weren't the President of the United States. These weren't mayors of the city. These weren't big politicians or wealthy billionaires. These were rural people who did huge things for God's kingdom at this moment, and their names are written right here, and I think that's important for us to remember. They're just regular folks who showed up to do what God asked them to do. And the passage names priests and Levites and gatekeepers, and again, everyday citizens. We look at verses 4 through 9 here, if you have your Bibles. I think it's significant that the people who moved to Jerusalem could trace their genealogy back several generations. Whether they could or someone else did it for them, it's in our scriptures that they were linked to the generations before them. The Judahites knew that their lineage stretched back to Perez, the son of Judah, who was their tribal head generations before. And they could name several family links along the way. They knew where they had come from. They knew where God had brought them. These Jews knew that the strength that they have derived from solidarity, not only from each other, but from a long line of people who God had been working through for generation after generation, through a covenant, through a promise, through something that was established and couldn't be broken. And it mentions Judah and Benjamin here, and it's interesting that these groups that are listed from Judah and Benjamin, they seem to be as if they're additional people to the 1/10. Because it lists all the 1/10 who got their lots cast, and then it says that some of Judah and Benjamin also settled. Volunteers. People who said, I didn't draw a lot, but I understand the gravity of this situation, and so we'll go too. I was thinking of, never mind, I won't go there with that reference. But I think this list emphasizes these tribes that lived in the southern region, the Levites, the Benjamins, the Judahs. But according to 1 Chronicles 9:3, the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh also settled here in the city. They're not listed here, but they also came and settled. Again, I have to understand or think that these are volunteers who didn't get the lot cast to them, but said this task is important. This registry that we find in this chapter does not include all the residents of the city, but focuses on the leaders, the ones who said, I will lead my people back to the city. And many are listed along with their official counterparts, the people who are over that section there, people who are like second in command, like it says in verse 9, or the leader who began the prayer and thanksgiving in verse 17. If we look in verses 10 through 14, we see individuals here. I think it's significant that the author felt it important to mention so many people by name, so many individuals. Not just the total number of the tribe. He gives that. He gives these great numbers of people that decided to go and resettle, but he mentions people by their personal name. And I think the reader is reminded of the reality of how this affected individuals. If we just saw tribes on a list, and that's just for us today in 2025, if we saw tribes on a list, we'd say, yeah, that was a group of people that went and moved. But we see individual names. We see the impact it had on individual people and families. I think more important to their time, they would understand this is Seth Hall getting up and leaving our community and going for God's purpose. This is Will Ham and his wife Dara and son getting up, and they're going to leave us. They're not coming back, but they're doing something greater and bigger for God's kingdom. I think that's why it lists these names and not just nameless mentions of tribes or numbers. Because the community is truly built on individuals working together. And it's built on the shoulders of their ancestors that God worked through to get them there. Think of monuments today that name people by name. Think of the impact it has when that name is listed as opposed to just being a monument. There's a lot of them that you could list, but just think of one that travels through here every year, not the actual monument, but a replica. The Vietnam War Memorial. Anybody ever seen that before? Nobody, just me? A couple of people. 58,318 names. They list every single person who lost their life in the conflict of the Vietnam War. And they list them not only by name, but in chronological order in the order in which they were killed. It's pretty significant. And what do people do when they go visit it? They find their ancestors. They take paper and scratch the name in it. They bring it back. This was important back then as it is today. This linkage to our genealogy, this linkage back to where we came from, and the sacrifice of those who made sure that we could be where we're at today. That's what's happening here. And the genealogy listed here is very similar to the one we find in 1 Chronicles 9. There are some differences in names. You'll see some differences between how names are spelt. I don't think we should take that as anything other than just a coincidence of the time where language changes or name change. No big deal there. Here in this section, 10 through 14, we see the mention of some strong warriors. I think it's interesting that, these people who are referred to as strong warriors are the priests. I saw a video I don't know if it was last night or this morning. Somebody, I think in New York City, kind of lost their mind and ran up on stage during a Catholic service and just waylaid one of the priests. He fell out, just knocked him out. That wouldn't have happened to these priests. These guys were standing guard. They were ready. I'm not saying that to disparage the guy in the video. He was in the middle of service, didn't know what was coming. But I thought about it as I was reading this chapter this morning. You talking about coming up here and waylaying me? Is that what's going on right here? Come on, I'm ready. Riley's down here threatening me. I'm talking about waylaying priests. She starts pointing at me. I hear you. This phrase, strong warriors in our Bibles, is usually concerning security and what we think of as strong warriors, people who are ready for battle. But the notion that clergy are also referred here as strong warriors should not be a surprise. I think a lot of times we read our Bibles and we think of, here's these priests in these robes, and they're going in, they're just doing sacrifice. Everybody else, it's their duty to do something else. Their duty to go out to battle, their duty to protect the city or the people. But that's not the case. If we read the book of Numbers, again, passages that a lot of times we just go through really fast. But we read Numbers 1 through, I think, 5 or 6. We'll see multiple mentions of the responsibility of the Levites to protect God's sanctum. I'll just give you one verse. Numbers 1:53 says, the Levites are to camp around the tabernacle of the testimony and watch over it so that no wrath will fall on the Israelite community. And we have a story later on in Numbers where someone is coming, a man and a woman are coming and doing inappropriate things at the doorway to the tabernacle. And this valiant warrior, who's a priest, runs a spear through the both of them because they were seeking to defile God's house. This term also denotes other strengths such as moral character and wealth and great character. These priests were ones of great character and strength. Looking at verses 15 through 24, just a few verses to note here. In verse 16, it seems that these two Levites were in charge of the outside work of the temple. Perhaps maybe the maintenance or, the janitors. And sometimes we think of people in those situations as being lower in our communities, in our society. But here, again, people mentioned by name who weren't doing the glorious work of the service inside. They're not going in and offering the sacrifices. They're not singing these great lofty praises in the temple or in the temple when it gets built. They're not doing all these things that would look good. They're doing the things probably nobody wanted to do, but they're mentioned by name in our scriptures. And people around the world read their name every day in our scriptures. It's the unseen jobs. I get to stand up here and I get the blessing of being able to relay the word to our community. But it's just as important that Jamin and his crew get to sit back there in the booth. They're sitting behind y'all. They're not in front of y'all. But they're just as important for the service that we bring to honor God every single week, every single Sabbath. In verse 17, it appears that this Mattaniah was the worship leader. And then he began prayer by giving thanks to God. Sound familiar? We've got Lawrence and his crew that leads worship every single week and start with giving thanks to God through prayer and supplication. Then we have Bakbukia, his assistant. This name's just funny. I just wanted a reason to bring it up because when I was taking Hebrew classes for years, bakbuk is the term for an empty jug. So sometimes things in the ancient world get their name, and even today sometimes, from different ways. Bakbuk doesn't have some great lofty meaning about where a jug comes from. If you just say it over and over again, say it over and over again. Bakbuk, 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 bakbuk. Sound like a jug emptying? That's where the name comes from. So I don't know what this says about Bakbukia, where his name really means an empty jug, but I don't know. This guy helped lead music ministry. What I think is important here is that music ministry of the temple was one of the main duties of the Levites. This music ministry, this worship, bringing praise, just leading the people in praise, but giving the praise back to God. I remember years ago, we were trying to iron out our worship. We'd been doing videos, and we'd gone through several different things downtown. And I asked Lawrence when he had kind of taken over and was starting to lead worship, and I asked him, could I speak to your people? I don't want to, look, I like our lanes. Like I stay in my lane. I don't try to get in other people's lanes. He's our worship leader. I'll tell you that I don't tell him what to bring for, neither does Nathan. Nobody tells him what to bring for praise and worship every week. That's his lane. God works through him in that lane. But I asked one time, could I come speak to your people? I think there may have been some conflict. I don't know. And I think that might have been why years ago there was some conflict in worship. And I said, I just want to give you some perspective. When it comes to the temple worship, in the ancient world, you never turned your back on the Holy of Holies in ancient Israel. So imagine like if I'm facing the Holy of Holies here and I've got a lot of work to do. I've got to go get animals. I've got to sacrifice them. I've got to bring them up on this altar. I've got to do all this work. But guess what? They did it while never turning their back on the Holy of Holies. They would sidestep and shuffle and walk backwards. They would always face the Holy of Holies. They would never turn their back on God. That's what they were kind of saying. Except for 2 times this would happen. Every morning when the high priest would come out of the holy place, he would stand on the steps into the holy place, and he would bless the people who had come to worship that day with the Aaronic blessing. He would do this, like the whole Star Trek symbol, right? That comes from the Bible. He would do this and bless them with the Aaronic blessing. He had his back to God, and this was very easy for people to understand because he's blessing the people with the words of God. It's not him turning his back on God, but it's God speaking through him to bless the people as he had instructed. But it confused scholars for a little while because the temple priests, who were part of the temple choir, they would stand in front of the altar and they too would turn their back on God. And we think of praise and worship as if it's a one-way street. Anybody think of it that way or thought of that in the past? That praise and worship was a one-way street. That we're giving praise to God. We're giving him all the glory and honor. That's not how they viewed it. Because the way they viewed praise and worship was that those who are leading you into worship, it's God singing praise over you and then you returning that same praise back. It's a two-way street. I did a little podcast thing this week, and everybody thinks of me, and I do podcasts every once in a while, and it's all about my biblical studies, my education, how I can help people understand the Bible a little bit better. But they asked me at the end, what is one thing that you want to know? They were like, I'll give it up to you. You can say whatever you want to at the end. I said, I think I would just remind people that studying the Scriptures is a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. The Scriptures are God speaking to us, but we should never be studying the Word without speaking back to God. That we should be praying back to God after we read it. That's what worship is about too. Lawrence has an incredible task of both bringing God's presence through His Word and the songs that we sing and leading us through that process as we sing then the words back to God. It's very important. I think this passage here emphasizes that this certain family had this element of ministry that was musically inclined. Because let's be honest, music is hereditary. The Nappier family is not up here singing praise and worship, okay? It's hereditary. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder. It got Dara over here in the Hall family. I'm not so sure about some of the others. But it's hereditary, and this family took it serious. And it was one of the best, one of the most important things that happened. And these people are mentioned here in verse 17, but they're also mentioned in a few minutes. We'll talk about it. In verse 20, it says that Israel had their inheritance. These people settled at their inheritance. But I think this word inheritance, nachalah, it's a very special word. I think it's used here intentionally because this is like this special treasure. And there's a few places where we've seen it in scriptures before. Exodus 34:9 says, "Then he said, my Lord, if I have indeed found favor with you, my Lord," this is Moses talking to God, "please go with us, even though this is a stiff-necked people. I went to the chiropractor one time, and they were like, "You have the straightest neck ever." I guess that's what he's talking about, stick-necked people. You are a stiff-necked people, not naked, stick-necked. That's new. "Forgive our iniquities and our misreadings of Scripture and our sin, and accept us at your own possession." Accept us as your own inheritance. Moses recognized that they were an inheritance to the Lord. Deuteronomy 4:20 says, "But the Lord selected you and brought you out of Egypt's iron furnace to be a people for his inheritance, as you are today." Inheritance, we think of something that like we didn't have, our ancestors had, and now we get to inherit it. Who did Yahweh inherit these people from? That's not what it necessarily means. Special treasure. The people were a special treasure to Yahweh. It's a different word in Exodus 19, but one of my favorite passages. "Now if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession, Segalah, my own special treasure out of all the peoples." To my knowledge, there's absolutely no parallel to this concept in the ancient Near East at all. I'm not saying I know everything, but I've never found where there's any connection. A lot of my studies have always been around how do we understand the Bible in relation to the world around it. I can't find anywhere where a people are considered the inheritance of a deity. That is unique to the one true God and only King of the universe. And Yahweh in turn has given every tribe a certain inheritance in the land he brought them to. It's this passing down, this divvying out. And it was important to them. It meant something to them to have this land. Naboth, for example, wouldn't sell King Ahab his God-given allotment in 1 Kings 21:3. It says, "But Naboth said to Ahab, as the Lord is my witness, I will never give my ancestors' inheritance to you." It was that important. He was not willing to give this piece of land to the king. Yahweh's not willing to give his people to anyone else. We see some of this in the New Testament where there is this receiving of a legacy from God. In Matthew 25, I'm not going to read it all, 14 through 28, it talks about talents and abilities and gifts that have to be developed and honed in, that these are inheritances that we get through our faith. We also have the promise of life everlasting. I can't speak today. Everlasting. This ultimate promised land. John speaks about it in 14:2-3, where he says, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? If I go away and prepare a place to you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also. You know the way to where I'm going." An inheritance that we have because of our faith in Yeshua. That when we follow him, when we become his disciples, that we have an inheritance to live with him continuously. Paul says in 2 Timothy 4:18, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil work and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen and amen." Hebrews 11:16, "But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It's interesting, Hebrews says he's prepared a city for them. And we see this in the Bible. We see that the people of God start out with just a couple of people in this garden on top of a mountain in Genesis. And by the time you get to the end of Revelation, and on Wednesday nights we'll get there probably in 2027, you see the garden has become this absurdly large city that's incomprehensible. But that's where we find ourselves in Nehemiah, is in the middle of that process. It's God bringing people from the garden to the big, absurdly large city on top of the world, and in the middle he's giving them this little ounce of what his promise is by calling these people to come and reestablish his city. I love 1 Peter 3-4. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because of his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you." What they were doing here in Nehemiah was trying to restore something that was perishable, had become defiled, and had faded away into the ruins. But he promises us one city that's not. I don't know. I would hope that maybe they saw what great picture they were doing, what great picture they were providing for the people of their time and for us today when they did this simple act of going and repopulating a city that God had called them to, as this picture of what God was going to do with the entire world. Imagine that. They're casting lots. They're coming out of their comfort zone. They don't want to necessarily go. They're going, and then you have volunteers who say, you know what, I'll go too. Could they see that their actions in that moment were exemplifying the gospel? Their actions in that moment were painting the picture of the gospel to the world around them and to us today. Do we see that with our actions when we answer God's call for obedience? Are we able to see that when we obey God and we do the things he calls us to do, individually and collectively as a community, that we're creating an image of the gospel in the world today? I would say it's pretty hard to see. I don't know that they saw it, but they were faithful and they obeyed. Verse 22, I said we're going to get back to the musician. Here it says there was a supervisor over all the Levites. It's interesting here that the supervisor over all the Levites was a musician. Lawrence, you're my boss now, man. This highlights, I think, the importance of praise and worship and the function that it had in the temple. And I think it certainly helps that Uzi, for him, that he could trace his ancestry back to Asaph. I think I've talked with Lawrence, and I haven't heard it for a while, but Lawrence, didn't you say you have people in your family, generations before, that could sing and love to sing, right? Did you? I don't know. Your uncle, that's right. I've heard you speak about these things. And sometimes it's like that, being able to trace it back, being able to say, this is what my uncle did. This is what, even military service. I was talking just last night maybe, or Thursday night, something. Our cousin, or my kid's cousin, my sister's daughter, said something to him about my great-grandfather served in World War II. And I'm like, yeah, same one you have. They're still trying to figure out cousins and what that means sometimes. I'm like, that's your great-grandfather too. And I have his stuff. I have his dog tags, his Purple Heart. I have his discharge papers, the flag he was given whenever he was brought home. Not only that, I have the flag that was given whenever he was buried. Why do we hold on to those things? Because it means something. And I think we need to see our service to the Lord as the same way. That we're passing down an inheritance to our children and our children's children, that they would look back hopefully and see the people in this room today as great warriors for God, great obedient people for God who displayed the gospel message in Monroe, Louisiana, and even beyond that. In 23, these musicians were so important that the king seems to have had some type of royal stipend or decree to keep them singing all the time. It wasn't just that they sang in the temple service. It seems that they were singing, and he was making sure that they sang and that they had the ability to do so every day. They had music and worship that accompanied the daily sacrifices, but here the king says, I'm going to make sure y'all keep singing. They were that good. Y'all ready to keep singing every day, 24/7? I don't know. These people we're talking about here, they're not famous. They're just faithful. They're not famous. They're just faithful. And we see this throughout. I was trying to think of, you could think of a million stories where people went ahead, not being famous, and made a path for other people. I went back to 9/11 and was looking at, what happened there, and tried to find one story that highlighted it. One was Stephen Siller, who was a firefighter at that time. Again, hundreds of firefighters that did crazy, amazing things there, but he had finished his shift. Like, he had the ability to go home. He had the ability to come off shift and to go to Brooklyn. Matter of fact, he ran through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel with 60 pounds of his gear whenever he realized that he might need to be a help to what situation was going on. I think about the volunteers from Benjamin and Judah, the volunteers from Manasseh and Ephraim that we later read about in our scriptures. It's like this guy who, after being through a whole lot, everybody's been through the exile, everybody's come back from the exile, everybody's just glad to be safe and secure and have somewhat of a stable life, and then all of a sudden God says, we need to go back here and resettle this place that's full of turmoil and everybody wants to blow it off the map. People picked up their 60 pounds of gear and ran through the tunnel and said, I'll go. I think we often think of important work as the work that happens when we're in the spotlight, the work that happens whenever people see that it's happening, or the work that looks like it makes the biggest impact. But I think real kingdom work often happens when ordinary people just step into faithfulness, and they do so in the background. I love working in the background sometimes. I love being able to affect change and then watch it happen with no one even knowing what you did. We end up here in the last few verses, 25 through 36. We see that not everyone moved to Jerusalem. Some stayed in their villages, they tended the land, and they did so to support the city. The city can't sustain itself on its own, but we understand here by the listing and how this chapter has progressed that both groups are essential to God's plan. Not just the people who go forward, not just the people who volunteer, not just the people who got a lot cast for them and repopulated the city, but all those who stayed out there in the rural areas and supported the city are just as important. The cities in which the Judahites settled comprise an area across the original allotment to Judah before they were exiled. It includes parts of the Negev, the southern desert that's south of Jerusalem. And these places of settlement from Beersheba to the valley of Hinnom, we see this in archaeology today. One of my favorite places to visit when I'm in Israel is the ruins of Beersheba. Middle of nowhere, top of a hill. Every time I've been, it's been freezing cold. The wind blows about 100 miles an hour, but it's great. It's an awesome place because it's one of the oldest places that we see in archaeology. And do you know that there are absolutely no coins have been found in archaeology that bear the name of the province Yehud, or Judah, outside of this area? They were there when they came, and they were there when they resettled. It's about 40 miles. So if you could imagine from here to the other side of Ruston, that's their region. And then towards the end, it lists the cities of Benjamin, and it reveals this territorial expansion that happens from the time from before. We think that Benjamin has now grown, but we have to realize that the Danites have given up their allotment already during the time of the judges. After the fall of Israel in the north, some of the Ephraimite territory was settled by Benjamin, as well. According to Numbers, the Levites were given 48 cities throughout the land of Israel for their possession. 48 cities. I think that this was important for several reasons. The arrangement made a fair way for providing for the Levites. You didn't stack all the Levites who couldn't work, who couldn't maintain their own income. You didn't stack them all in one tribe and say, now y'all support this whole other tribe. He spreads them out through the land of Israel. He distributes them throughout the population. It also made available all of these priests to everyone in Israel. For example, the 6 Levitical cities that were set aside for the refuge for persons accused of manslaughter until a matter could come up for trial. What if that one city of refuge was like way down in the south? Good luck. Y'all better have your running shoes on because they're coming after you. Slow people wouldn't make it. I would feel bad for those who committed manslaughter against the Hall family, because you got Seth and Nathan coming after you. That city better be really close for you. The Levites could also be available as teachers. I forgot Christy, I'm sorry. She's coming with her steak as well, running after. She'd catch me, I promise. You also had the Levites who were available to be teachers, to leaders in the community. Deuteronomy 17 tells us that was part of their duty. It says, you are to go to the Levitical priest and to the judge who presides at that time and ask, and they will give you a verdict in the case. Talking about cases that you couldn't figure out on your own, you must abide by the verdict they give you at the place the Lord chooses. Be careful to do exactly what they instruct you. And now this seems very judicial. It's very straightforward. It's legal language. But verse 11, you must abide by the instructions they give you and the verdicts they announce to you. Do not turn to the right or the left from the decision they declare to you. They were there for all wisdom. They were there to help understand God's intention and His instructions. They were there to teach. And they could readily collect the tithes from these places. It tells us that just in the last chapter. I think when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah as a whole, we see that the lack of Levites was a problem for the people at that time. Here's what I find in these last part of this chapter. Some are called to visible roles. Others are quite invisible. Others are called to serve quietly. If I stepped into the role of our worship singers, you'll ask me to step into the quiet zone as well. But both are needed. Everybody's needed. Here in this church, there's a lot that goes on to bring this service. It's not even just what you see today. It's what happens all throughout the week. It's what happens all throughout the week for the preparation of what happens for both our worship team, for me and Nathan, the study that goes into it, for the team in the back that has to make sure that everything's going right and running right. If you ever see Jamin run outside the door, he's probably trying to check like something's off with the audio. He's got to go out there and listen to what's going on the live stream versus what's happening in here. All that stuff's going on. And that's not just here in ministry. These people that were called to Jerusalem were doing so. This was part of their daily life, part of their family. It's not just in ministry, but in our work and our family. Our faithfulness in the small things matters in a great way. Being able to say, yes, I will come over here and I'll take part of this 10 men who are going to roll a dice and see which one of us is leaving this area forever. Small little decision to go play a game. Big impact on the kingdom of God. In Nehemiah's day, the winners of the lottery had to give up the comfort of God's mission, but their faithfulness ensured Jerusalem's survival. Ensured that the people would have a place to come and worship God. Ensured that there was a place where heaven and earth would continue to overlap each other. Ensured that there was a place where people could experience the Garden of Eden in just a small bit once again. For us, we have to ask where God's calling us. Is it difficult? I've been encouraged lately, if you haven't heard the Hibbett story of moving back. And I thought I knew the story until a couple weeks ago, David tells me more of the story, where God lined things up. And He lined things up for them just because they simply obeyed and said, yes, we're going to step out in this uncomfortable way. We're going to step out and go back to this uncomfortable place. Their family's here, so it's kind of comfortable, but they were comfortable where they were. He had a practice, a medical practice. We're going to step out. We're going to go and move to this place. It was difficult, I'm sure. But God was calling them to do it, and we're seeing God work through them. Will we be faithful even if it's not glamorous? That's the question I think this chapter is asking us. Will we just be obedient in the smallest way so that God could work through us in the biggest way? I think that I hope and I'll pray, and as I close in prayer, I'll pray that we could all say yes to whatever God calls us to. No matter what comfort level it is, or no matter even if it seems dangerous, no matter if it's stepping out in faith in a way that you say, I may fall flat on my face, but I feel like I'm being called to do this. I pray that we'll all say yes to that call, no matter how big or small. Join me in prayer, and the worship team will come up and lead us in final worship. If you need prayer, I'll be up here, Nathan's up here. your neighbors next to you. If you need prayer, don't leave without getting prayer. If you need to confess, this mic is always here. We've seen some amazing things happen when people come and bring their confessions before the church. If you need to come and give a word, if God's calling you to give a word to us today, mic's open. Join me in prayer. Father, we come before you today, and we give you thanks for the faithfulness of the people, our ancestors, generations and generations before us, who acted in obedience so that today in Monroe, Louisiana in 2025, we'd have the ability to come, give glory to your name, and worship you as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, as the creator of the universe, who through his sovereignty has been working his plan of redemption throughout the history of mankind so that we would forever rest with you in that great, enormous city sitting on top of an enormous mountain in the end, that we would be able to live in your presence forever. I pray that you would encourage the people of this church and this community that whenever you call on us to do things big or small, that we would have the courage, the safety and the security and the trust in you to say yes no matter what it is. That they would be able to realize and see that times of discomfort are times for growth, not just for themselves, but for the kingdom. And that we would see ourselves beyond our individuals, that we would understand that to live a life of faith is to live faith communally and not individually. That we would place ourselves before others, that we would be able to see your kingdom work established in our lives by obedience to answering whatever call you have for us. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks.